Hello, everybody. Recently on the show, the United States, as what might think of as a global liberal hegemon, hasn't been getting a great press. We did a show a few days ago with the author of The Shortest History of Israel and Palestine, the London-based Michael Scott Bauman, about America's failure to bring any kind of peace to the Middle East. We also did a show with Saad Hosseini, one of Afghanistan's leading media moguls. He has a new book out, Radio Free Afghanistan, in which he talks about the growing crisis in Afghanistan. We've done lots of shows on Afghanistan in the past. One, for example, with Elliot Ackerman, who describes America's end in Afghanistan, this catastrophic end. He encourages us to think of it in terms of a classic 5-act tragedy. And it's not just the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, and Afghanistan. It's also Iraq. A couple of years ago, we had Ruben Gallego, who's now running, I think, for Senate in Arizona. A very distinguished, impressive man who fought in Iraq. He had a new book out back then. They called us lucky, about the catastrophic war in Iraq. So maybe there's a time to dismiss America's role in the world as what people think of as a liberal hegemon. I think, though, that my guest today might disagree. He indeed has a new book out, The United States as Global Liberal Hegemon, How the US Came to Lead the World. Edward Goldberg has been teaching at NYU for many years, and he's joining us from his home in the Upper West Side in Manhattan. Edward, congratulations on the new book, The United States as Global Liberal Hegemon. You're probably the last man left in the world to believe in the United States. Is that fair?
Well,
at least as a liberal hegemon, whatever that means.
I think also Secretary Blinken also believes in it, and I think President Biden believes in that. You know, Blinken, when he came into office, made the statement, the world doesn't organize itself. And I think we're still in that same position. The world does not organize itself, and it needs a force to organize it. And basically, I think if you look at it, the United States, good or bad, is the only one around for this role. When I began the book, I actually had doubts about it. And I still, whether the U.S. should have this role. I still have doubts whether the U.S. can fulfill the role, but I think the role is absolutely necessary. Hello? Did I somehow lose you? Hello? Hello? I can't hear you though. Hello?
Can you hear me now, Edward?
I can hear you. I have no idea what just happened.
It's the liberal hegemons. Let's
The spirits of the anti-hegemon took over.
yeah. Should we start again? Do you want to just
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. Here we go. Let's just start again. I'll cut it out. Okay. I'll try and shorten the intro as well. Okay. Ready to go, Edward?
Yes.
Here we go. Hello, everybody. Let me start again. Hello, everybody. Over the last few episodes, America, at least its foreign policy, hasn't been getting a great press. We did a show with my friend Michael Scott Bauman, a keen observer of the failure to establish any kind of peace between Israel and Palestine. His book, The Shortest History of Israel and Palestine, blames America in many ways for failing to bring about a peace in Israel-Palestine. We've got, of course, the catastrophe in Afghanistan. We did a show recently with Saad Husseini, media mogul there. We've done many shows on the failure of Afghanistan, including with with Elliot Ackerman, author of The Fifth Act, that sees the Afghan crisis, or the failure of American foreign policy in Afghanistan, as a 5-act classical crisis. And then there's the catastrophe in Iraq, which we've talked about many times in the past before, including with Ruben Gallego, a very distinguished American politician running for the Senate in Arizona, whose book, They Called Us Lucky, calls out the fundamental irresponsibility and unaccountability of American elites. So is American foreign policy, especially in the 21st century, is it one long series of disasters? Perhaps not, according to our guest today. Edward Goldberg teaches politics and economics at New York University. He's based in Manhattan, and he has a new book out, The United States as Global Liberal Hegemon. And as I said, Edward is joining us from the Upper East Side. Edward, are you the last liberal hegemon left in the United States or the world?
No, I think there are actually a couple of us, to say the least. We have, of course, Secretary Blinken, who, when he first came into office, made the statement, the world doesn't organize itself. And, of course, we have President Biden. But getting back to Secretary Blinken's statement, I think it's absolutely correct. The world does not organize itself. The natural role of the world, because of geography and culture and history, is chaos. And there needs to be a power or an overriding body in some way to manage that chaos. When I first began to write the book, I wasn't quite sure if the U.S. should be that. In fact, the original title of the book was Who Elected America? In writing the book, I came to realize the necessity of the role. Now, I think America is there to have that role. Whether America can do it is another story because of its internal conflicts. But for sure, the world needs it.
Yeah, that's a different issue. The fact that you mentioned Biden, who seems halfway in his grave, is perhaps an indictment of your argument, and Blinken, who's hardly distinguished himself as a great Secretary of State, or certainly a historically memorable one. Would you agree, Edward, that American foreign policy, mostly over the last 20 years, has been an absolute disaster? Every overseas conflict they've got into has been embarrassing and shameful and catastrophic for the Afghans or the Iraqis?
Actually, I would not. Look, I think what happens with hegemons throughout history is...
What is that? By the way, Edward, I apologize for jumping in here. What exactly is a hegemon? Sounds like a hedgehog.
A hegemon is a leading power. And if we look at the word liberal hegemon, we look at the word liberal from classic Enlightenment theory as someone who believes in the rule of law, the rights of the individual, and a free market. Not, we use the word liberal now as bandied about totally incorrectly, as a slur. Someone is a liberal politically now, it's that he's a socialist or communist. That's actually is not what the word means whatsoever. But No, I think the prime example, and I disagree with you greatly about Biden,
Well,
is
that he's not half in his grave.
no, that we're all here in our grade. But I think they've done a tremendous job as exactly what the liberal hegemon should do, coalescing its allies on the Ukrainian situation. And I
Yeah, the
think
Ukraine is perhaps a better argument. What about American failure, though, in the Middle East? As I said, we just did a show with Michael Scott Bauman. The more the Middle East seems to be spinning into a broader war, Lebanon, Iran, Israel, Gaza. Doesn't that reflect America's failure as, again, I don't know whether you want to call them a liberal hegemon, but certainly a world power who's invested many
no,
billions of dollars and many hours and their own credibility in failing to solve a massive problem?
no. Obviously, look, I think no one would deny that the Second Iraq War was a very tragic mistake based a lot on hubris. Okay, no one would deny that. But no, I don't. I think the Middle East is an extremely complicated place, and with both state actors and non-state actors, with egos that all politicians have and non-egos, with historical memories that really corrupt action. I think it's a very complicated situation, and I think the U.S. is basically doing its best. Also, one we have to realize that in the term liberal hegemon, in today's world, the U.S. is actually the first democracy or semi-democracy to be a hegemon, a real hegemon. You know, the UK was a hegemon for a couple hundred years, but at that time, foreign policy in the UK was made by what club you sat on the Pall Mall. It wasn't a foreign policy of the democracy. Here, it even becomes more complicated because it needs to be a foreign policy of the democracy. So the Mideast is not an easy situation. I don't think we've blown it. I don't know if it's a solvable situation.
Are there any dangers? You mentioned the Ukraine. Are there any dangers that Ukraine is increasingly looking like Vietnam, America slipping and sliding into a bigger war that nobody quite wants or understands as Ukraine uses more American armaments and America commits itself more and more? I mean, you mentioned Biden. He has made some comments about becoming more involved in the war in Ukraine against Russia.
Well, let's start in the beginning. Russia definitively invaded Ukraine. Russia definitively had a treaty with Ukraine that it made in the mid 1990s, guaranteeing Ukraine's territorial integrity. Russia violated that treaty. The principles, one of the main principles of the horrors of World War II was that all of us, that the Allies won the war on, countries don't invade other countries. This goes back to the Westphalian treaties of the mid 16th century on the ideas of sovereignty. Countries should not invade other countries. So it's a major principle to be held up here that you don't invade other countries. Russia did that, and actually, as I mentioned, violated the document it signed. Biden was extremely good at building a coalition, doing exactly what the liberal hegemon should do in this day and age, of getting NATO support for on Ukraine's side, and actually boosting the size of NATO. Biden has, however, has a problem. In the book, I criticize Obama for when Assad gassed some of his people. Obama gave a major speech, a beautiful speech. I quote part of it in the book, of how this is a no-no and the world must take action, and the United States must take action.
Yeah, he talked about a red line, didn't he? Of
Yes,
Assad
exactly.
crossing.
Right, and an absolutely gorgeous speech. And once again, like like sovereignty, like the issue of invading a nation, since 1919, the end of World War One, gassing has been a no-no. And Assad gasped at his people. Okay, great speech from Obama. The next day or the following day, whatever, he got extremely nervous, and where he could have just lobbed a couple missiles into Syria, which of course might have killed people, which would be not a nice thing for sure. But it would be the sense of the cop giving out a ticket. And to be the liberal hegemon, you have to be some ways the cop. And a cop that doesn't give out tickets is not a cop. Okay, fast forward to Ukraine. Biden was the cop, started to give out tickets. But the question is, at what level do you escalate to change that changes the whole situation? Because at what level, and it's different than the Obama decision. Obama decision was just to fire a couple missiles. Biden's decision, which is he's being blamed for hesitating, but the hesitation is extremely understandable, is at what time do you allow the Ukrainians to use American weaponry to go into Russia proper? And what would be Putin's response, and would it be nuclear? That's a whole different level.
I take your point. It's complicated. Everybody knows that, Edward. But you mentioned earlier that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a complete no-no. That ever since the Treaty of Westphalia, you haven't been allowed to invade other countries. But as we said at the beginning, America, at the beginning of the 21st century, invaded both Iraq and Afghanistan. So how can it have any moral authority when its foreign policy is so profoundly hypocritical?
It is. I can't argue with that. One of the problems of being the hegemon and liberal hegemon is you sometimes get involved in your own local politics, which force you to do things, and it becomes very difficult. I think this is no different than the United Kingdom in the middle and late 19th century, when it
Yeah,
was.
but as you said, the British never described themselves as liberal hegemons. Why not just drop this liberal hegemon nonsense and just talk about the United States as a global power, and that sometimes it has to do things out of self-interest.
Well,
Sometimes it has a sense of moral duty. But why
I
talk
think
about this thing called liberal hegemon?
because a hegemon means a global power, and a liberal hegemon vis-a-vis, let's say, Russia or China, which are illiberal countries. I think it's a very good definition, actually.
But it never works in practice. We go back, I want to talk historically. I mean, throughout the 20th century, the United States and Latin America supported the least liberal countries in the world, from Pinochet's China, Chile, to many other kinds of dictatorships.
For sure we did. For sure we
So
did.
why not just, no, I take your point on hegemon, even though it's a rather ugly word. Why not just drop the liberal? It's clearly contradictory and hypocritical, and only annoys the rest of the world.
You have some point there, but there's still it's still a differential. There is still a differential between an illiberal hegemon and a liberal hegemon. Now,
why not just quote about a hegemon? Why even have these terms, liberal or illiberal? They're meaningless.
Well, I don't think they are meaningless. I think there's a difference between what the Russian state perceives it stands for and what the United States perceives it stands for philosophically. I don't think it is meaningless.
Well, what about in the Middle East, for example, where perhaps Saudi or Russian money and political support is used on behalf of the Palestinians? That's a liberal cause, that the Americans are on the other side. That doesn't make Russia a liberal hegemon. It simply makes it a great power that sometimes supports issues that appear to be liberal, but probably aren't, or more complicated than that.
Well, I think that's exactly. Look, no definition is perfect, obviously.
Well, you've chosen this term, global liberal hegemon, as the title of your book.
I didn't know, not global. Yes, exactly. Global. I'm sorry. Global liberal hegemon. Yes.
So, I mean, you can't get out of that one, Edward.
No, I cannot get out of that one. You're absolutely correct. But I believe, once again, liberal describes some overriding principles. Look, the world is not perfect. America's not perfect. Human beings are not perfect. But it's an aspirational word.
But I wonder if they're just Americans. And I want to talk. I do want to talk historically, because you're being a good sport, taking all this criticism. I want to see your historical analysis of how America became this global power. Wouldn't it be better if America just dropped all this verbiage of liberal and do good for the world? It would make it a much more effective power, wouldn't it?
No, I don't actually think so. I don't actually think so. I think, for instance, if you look at why is America the liberal hegemon, what gives us?
It's only because you say they are. I'm not convinced. I don't think many others are. Maybe Joe Biden and Tony Blinken, and that's about it. The three of you are left.
Then we have three people at least. But what gives us? Why are we a hegemon? I mean, why isn't Europe a hegemon? Why isn't other countries a hegemon?
Well, you know that the answer to that. You have massive military, economic, and cultural power. There's no debate about the hegemony. That's given.
No, but part of that hegemony is the fact that we have allies. And we have allies, and they're not forced allies like under the Soviet Union system. These allies decide to be with us in an umbrella type of relationship. The reason for this is because of partly because of shared cultural values, partly because of those liberal values.
Well, there again, I don't want to keep on bringing up Pinochet, but I'm not sure he shared the Americans shared any liberal values with him. So let's go back historically. Let's see the origins of it. One of the astonishing statistics for me, Edward, which may explain the problems with American foreign policy, is that just before the outbreak of the Second World War, the size of America's standing army was the size of Sweden or Portugal. It was a tiny army, a country which was in no way militarized. Is one of the problems with America that its responsibility as a global power, what you call a liberal hegemon, was dumped on it because of the terrible civil war in the First World War in Europe, and then the failure of Europe to rebuild itself in the 20s and 30s.
Yes, I agree with you. I agree with you. Basically, power filled a vacuum, and Franklin, I believe that America's role as the quote global liberal hegemon originated in.
We'll have to have a drinking contest. Every time you say that, Edward, we'll take a shot of whiskey.
Yes. I believe it began with Franklin Roosevelt. It began actually in his State of the Union speech about the four freedoms, which then became part of the Atlantic Charter that he signed with.
What year was that?
41.
Yeah.
And then you had the Atlantic Charter that he signed with Churchill, which basically included those four freedoms. Actually, I just saw them here on Roosevelt Island in New York City the other day, inscribed in stone. But that's when it began. And then it actually, of course, America being the arsenal of democracy, just helped it further.
The arsenal of democracy? That sounds rather unpleasant.
Well, that was Roosevelt's word for supporting people during World War II.
Yeah, I'm joking. I know. I've been to the museum in New
Right.
Orleans, the World
So,
War
yeah,
II museum.
so, and then it really got a huge jump start at Bretton Woods in 1944.
But then, Edward, I take your point, and certainly FDR is a remarkable man. And if there is a man who somehow epitomizes the US as global liberal hegemon, it's FDR. But there's the other side of the coin. There's the descent into the Cold War, the paranoia associated with that, the decision by Truman to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, and this American obsession with militarizing itself and creating these two worlds. I mean, of course, the Soviets were also responsible. So is one of the reasons, could one argue that one of the reasons why there are many people, I'm joking with you, of course, there are many other people who believe in America as a liberal hegemon today, but one of the reasons it's been such a struggle is because the origins of American global power are rooted in the Cold War, which are very complicated and problematic.
Well, actually, I think the origins actually rooted in World War II, not in the Cold War. And that's why I emphasized before what happened at Bretton Woods, where the dollar became the reserve currency and replaced the pound sterling in the world as the reserve currency. Um, so, the Cold War was what it was. It was a conflict between two systems, basically. And the US, in my mind, fortunately won.
Yeah, but it also resulted, again, talking of invasions of other countries and the wars in Korea and Vietnam. And
right, it was, look, it's not fun. It was called war for a reason. It's not fun. And could it, history's 2020. Could you have rethink it now? Could Truman have been less aggressive with Stalin? Possibly. Or maybe his aggression with Stalin was correct. We don't know that.
When we talk about the global hegemon, you talk about Bretton Woods and also the foundation. FDR was dead by then, but his widow attended the foundation of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. Is one of the problems, Edward, that Americans often confuse itself because it's an immigrant society and because of its liberal universalist foundations. Americans often confuse itself with the United Nations, as in not, in some ways, a clear division of power between the two.
I think today there is a clear division of power. I think we see the United Nations, and this is another reason why you need a hegemon. I think you see the United Nations as a superb institution for smaller states, a superb institution on with some problems, I admit, with World Health.
Well, can you give me some examples how the UN has benefited smaller states? It certainly hasn't benefited the Palestinians.
No, but they've been obviously not. But they've been in peacekeeping missions all over Africa. They've done. They benefited from all the subsidiary organizations, whether it's the World Health Organization. We can criticize it because of the initial COVID problem, but it's still the only thing the world has. We have the Law of the Seas Conference under the UN. We have the same thing with rules for airlines under the UN. So on both smaller states and on non-issues of great powers, the UN has done a fairly good job. On issues of great powers, the way the UN is set up from the beginning, it's a failure.
Your previous book was entitled Why Globalization Works for America, How Nationalist Trade Policies Are Destroying Our Country. I don't think either political party would agree with you now. Hasn't Trump changed the whole conversation? Maybe you and Tony Blinken and Joe Biden still believe in globalization, but Kamala Harris doesn't seem to anymore.
I just started to write a new essay about the word I hated most in high school world history class called mercantilism.
Mercantilism, right, which it means, of course, the opposite of globalization.
Right, which just means the opposite of globalization, and it means trade policy of nationalism. And of course, that was disproven in the early 19th century by the great British economist David Ricardo with with this theory of comparative advantages. But it always comes back somehow. It's like whack-a-mole. You can't get rid of mercantilism. And it becomes the confrontation between enlightened economics and domestic politics. Take example, what's going on, and this is going on with the Biden administration, not with Trump, with Nippon wants to buy U.S. steel. The Japanese are one of our closest allies. We theoretically believe in free trade. This should be a no-brainer. But Trump, back when he was president, made steel jobs an issue. And steel jobs are actually not an issue theoretically, because steel jobs generally, the majority of them have not been lost to exports, but have been lost to automation of steel mills. So you just don't need so many people employed in a steel mill anymore. But that's more difficult sell. The easier sell is to blame the other guy.
Well, aren't you a man whose history is, I wouldn't say passed by, but just as Edmund Burke couldn't make sense of the French Revolution and the revolutionary times of the 19th century, early 19th century, the world has changed, Edward. Your belief in globalization no longer really exists. There's a handful of idealists, maybe liberal idealists left like yourself, but everybody else has moved on. I mean, you bring up Trump. I'm guessing, like myself, you're not a big fan. Has his kind of illiberalism or neo-authoritarianism, has that been the death knell of globalization? It's not just him, of course. There are many other illiberals around the world, from Orban to Modi to Putin to probably Xi in Beijing. The world has changed.
Well, first, it depends what you call globalization. What's happening is we really have not, world trade has not fallen, international trades. In fact, it's come back nicely since the pandemic. So, it's what one calls globalization. The world has definitely become more into blocks, very much like pre-World War I Europe. So we've got blocks have become much, much more important. Look, we know history goes up and down and in cycles, and we know that when you are in a period of massive economic change, which we are in now, based on automation and AI and technology, it's fearful to people, and its nationalism becomes more important. And one or another political leader will use that fear to move for support instead of talking about the future.
So what are, Edward, the best arguments? You mentioned Bretton Woods. It might be a hard example to explain to ordinary voters. For somebody who isn't a sophisticated economist, what are the best arguments for America, and real concrete arguments, examples for the history of America as what you call it's not a term I like, a global liberal hegemon, your term?
Well,
this from Bretton Woods.
This is the problem I end my book with. How do you, once again, as I said earlier, we're the first hegemon to be some more or less a democracy. So the question is, how do you explain to people what benefit do they get from us being this hegemon? How do you explain it to the citizen? It's so, the benefits are so ubiquitous, they're so out there. I was actually talking in class yesterday. We all buy jeans for let's say at Gap for $60. If they were made here, they'd be over $200. So we all have $140 extra to spend on other things. That's a benefit, okay? But there's no mass block of voters that are saying, "Oh, we love our cheap jeans." They just accept it. It's ubiquitous. The Iowa soybean farmer who's protected by the U.S. Navy and sending, multi hundreds of thousands of tons of soybeans overseas. He or she doesn't see that it's the U.S. Navy that's protecting his shipments or her shipments. So one of the problems in convincing the American citizen the importance of the U.S. being the hegemon is to be more clear on the benefits.
Well, you're right, but that was the question I asked you, and you presented it as if it's like making the argument for water to fish. It's all around them. It's so ubiquitous. But what concrete examples? I said you've mentioned Bretton Woods. What are the other examples of the U.S. as a global liberal hegemon? That is how the U.S. has come to lead the world. What examples would you use? What are the examples you use in class? You teach at NYU.
I would use freedom of the seas as an example, which is one of the oldest documents, one of the oldest doctrines in American foreign policy.
Did that not exist before the U.S.?
Not so much. Not so much, I would say. I would say the British Navy, when it came to its needs, would seize other countries' sailors.
Okay, well, what else? Give me some more sort of perhaps a little bit more contemporary examples over the last 50 years, for example.
Okay, in the last 50 years, I would, it gets back to the Bretton Woods and it gets a little complicated.
Well, Bretton Woods was more than 50 years ago.
No, I said it gets back to Bretton Woods. I didn't use Bretton Woods as it's the U.S. being the reserve currency. So in 2008, when was the huge crash, because the U.S. dollar, as I said, is the reserve currency, and it's the currency used most around the world for international business and for international loans, instantly there became a dollar shortage because people were afraid who had money, who didn't, a liquidity crisis. The U.S. Federal Reserve opened its window and lent billions and billions of dollars around the world. And the U.S. Federal Reserve actually at that time more or less became the central bank of the world, a role of the hegemon, and stopped what could have been a total economic disaster. They repeated that during the heyday of the COVID crisis more so, and even lent out more money. No one else in the world can do that role.
Yeah, so those are interesting examples. I'm not sure where the liberal exists there, although they're interesting arguments. So really, then, it's no coincidence that Trump is not only, of course, an opponent of the idea of America as a global liberal hegemon, but also is a champion of cryptocurrency. I'm guessing that you see the fashion for cryptocurrency and digital currency as challenges to the Federal Reserve as problematic in terms of the US's role as a hegemon.
I honestly can't speak on it. I'm not an expert on cryptocurrency. Professor Fabini at NYU is one of the leading critics of it in the country, but I actually can't speak on it.
Well, finally, Edward, let's end with a warning. It seems as if America is drifting away, for better or worse, from being a global liberal hegemon. Even Harris seems ambivalent about tariffs and what you call mercantilism. What happens if America simply gives up the idea of itself as a global liberal hegemon?
I think we are in a world, a free fall world. We're in a world. Once again, I began talking about the basic operating system of the world is chaos, and we become in a more chaotic, more threatening world.
Well, that's a
I think the world needs, once again, maybe it's only Tony Blinken and myself that think this. The world needs some organizing factor.
well, without Tony Blinken and Edward Goldberg, we'd be back in a Hobbesian world. Is that right, Edward?
I would think so.
Well, thank you so much. Congratulations on the new book. Interesting conversation, important conversation. You are against the grain. You're unfashionable, which makes you interesting. And we'll have to get you back on the show, Edward, to talk more about American role in the world and whether it can indeed or should indeed become a hegemon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye-bye.